Have you ever walked into a room where everyone wanted you to leave? Where the silence wasn't empty, but heavy with judgment? Sarah Miller knew that silence. She wore a dress that cost $20 to a gala where the napkins cost $50. They whispered that she was David's charity case. They laughed at her worn shoes. They called her poor. But they didn't know that the woman standing in the corner, holding a glass of tap water, held a secret that could buy and sell everyone in that room. Watch closely, because the moment her name is truly spoken, the laughing stops forever. The rain in Seattle was relentless that November, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes the grey pavement look like polished slate. For Sarah Miller, it was just another Tuesday of dodging puddles in boots that had seen better winters. She adjusted the collar of her trench coat, a practical beige thing she'd found at a consignment shop in Ballard 3 years ago, and hurried towards the bus stop. In her hand, she clutched a plastic bag containing David's dry cleaning. In her mind, she was calculating the grocery budget for the week. If she skipped the artisanal coffee David liked, they could afford the good steak for his celebratory dinner on Friday. David Miller was a good man. A brilliant architect, yes, but more importantly, a man who saw Sarah when everyone else looked right through her. When they met 4 years ago at a public library, he hadn't asked about her family, her background, or why a woman with an accent that sounded like old money was working as a shelving clerk. He just asked if she liked the book she was holding. They married 6 months later in a courthouse ceremony. No guests, no family. Just them and a homeless man named Arthur, who they paid $20 to be a witness. Tonight, however, the bubble of their quiet, modest life was about to be punctured. David came home looking paler than usual. He loosened his tie, the cheap polyester blend rustling. "Richard wants everyone at the Winter Solstice Gala," David said, dropping his keys in the bowl. "Everyone, spouses included." Sarah froze while chopping carrots. Richard Kensington was the senior partner at David's firm, Kensington and Associates. He was a man who measured people by the cut of their suits and the pedigree of their degrees. He had tolerated David because David was a workhorse, but he had never invited them to the inner circle events. "The gala?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady. "That's at the Fairmont Olympic, isn't it?" "Black tie?" "Strictly," David sighed, slumping onto their second-hand sofa. "I tried to get out of it, Sarah. I know it's not our scene. But Richard made it clear. A promotion to junior partner is on the line. If I don't show face, and show it well, he gives the spot to Carter." Carter. Sarah knew the name. Carter Banks was the office golden boy. Mediocre talent, but a family trust fund that ensured he vacationed in the Hamptons and drove a Porsche. His wife, Jessica Banks, was worse. She was the self-appointed queen of the firm's social circle, a woman who treated waiters like furniture and other women like competition. Sarah wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked over to David, smoothing the hair back from his forehead. "Then we go," she said softly. "We go, and you get that promotion." "Sarah, the tickets alone are covered by the firm, presumably." "Yes, but the clothes, the expectations. You know how Jessica and her crew are. They tear people apart for sport." David looked up at her, his eyes filled with worry. "I don't want you to be their target. We can't afford a gown that fits in there." Sarah smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of her lips that David had always loved but never quite understood. "David, elegance isn't about the price tag. It's about the carriage. I'll find something. Don't you worry about me." The next day, Sarah didn't go to a boutique. She went to the back of her closet. She pulled out a garment bag that had been zipped shut for 5 years. Inside was a dress of midnight blue velvet. It was simple, almost severe in its lack of sequins or beading, but the cut was architectural perfection. It had a high neck, long sleeves, and a back that plunged dangerously low. It wasn't new. In fact, it was vintage, a bespoke piece made in 1958 for a grandmother she never spoke of, but to the untrained eye, it was just an old, dark dress. She inspected the hem. It was pristine. "This will do," she whispered to the empty apartment. But the dress was just armor. The war would be the people. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel was a cavern of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and the suffocating scent of expensive perfume. A string quartet played Debussy in the corner, largely ignored by the 300 guests who were busy networking and assessing each other's net worth. When Sarah and David walked in, the temperature seemed to drop. David looked handsome in a rented tuxedo, though the sleeves were a fraction too short. He was nervous, his hand gripping Sarah's arm a little too tightly. Sarah, by contrast, moved with a fluid, terrifying calm. She walked not like a woman entering a party, but like a ship cutting through calm waters. She held her head high, her neck elongated, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. She wore no jewelry, no earrings, no necklace, just her plain gold wedding band. "There they are!" A shrill voice cut through the ambient chatter. Near the center of the room, holding court by the ice sculpture, was Jessica Banks. She was wearing a crimson dress that screamed "Season's latest collection," dripping in diamonds that caught the light aggressively. Flanking her were two other wives of senior associates, Ashley and Brittany, looking like carbon copies in pastel silk. David tensed. "Let's just get a drink and find a corner." "Nonsense," Sarah said, steering him gently but firmly towards the center. "You are here to make partner, David. We do not hide in corners." As they approached the group, Jessica's eyes raked over Sarah. It was a physical inspection, starting at the shoes, simple black pumps, well polished but visibly worn at the soles if one looked closely, and traveling up the velvet dress to Sarah's bare neck. "David," Jessica cooed, ignoring Sarah entirely. "We didn't think you'd make it. Carter was just saying how expensive the babysitters are these days. I assume that's why you're usually absent?" "We don't have children, Jessica," David said stiffly. "Oh, right. Of course." Jessica finally turned her gaze to Sarah, feigning surprise. "And this must be Sarah, is that right?" "Good evening, Mrs. Banks," Sarah said. Her voice was low, modulated perfectly. Jessica let out a tinkling, cruel laugh. "Mrs. Banks? Oh, honey, please, call me Jessica. We aren't in a board meeting." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a stage whisper meant to be heard by the circle around them. "Although, looking at that dress, I wonder if you thought we were going to a funeral. It's very heavy." "Velvet? In a heated ballroom?" Ashley giggled. "It's very vintage, isn't it? Like thrift store vintage?" Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't blush. She simply looked at Ashley with a gaze so direct that Ashley stopped giggling mid-breath. "It is vintage," Sarah replied comfortably. "It has history. I prefer clothes that have lived a life rather than those that have merely been manufactured." Jessica's eyes narrowed. She wasn't used to the mouse fighting back. "Well, aren't you quaint?" "Carter, darling, come here." Carter Banks sauntered over, a scotch in hand, looking already slightly flushed. "David, good to see you, buddy." "Hey, I heard about the Johnson account." "Good work. Shame about the bonus, though, huh?" David blinked. "What about the bonus?" "Oh, you didn't hear?" Carter smirked, glancing at Richard Kensington, who was chatting with a senator nearby. Richard decided to pool the bonuses this year into the firm's expansion fund. Tough break. I know you guys probably needed it. He let the silence hang, heavy and humiliating. The implication was clear. We have money, so we don't care. You are poor, so you are suffering. David's jaw tightened. "We're doing just fine, Carter." "Are you?" Jessica interjected, pointing a manicured nail at Sarah's empty wrist. "I mean, surely if you were doing fine, your wife wouldn't be walking around so unadorned. Not even a cubic zirconia, David? It's almost cruel." The circle of socialites laughed. It was a light, fluttering sound, like birds pecking at crumbs. Sarah felt David's hand tremble. He was about to snap. He was about to ruin his career to defend her honor. She couldn't let him do that. Not yet. She placed a calming hand over his. Her skin was cool. "Jewelry is often a distraction," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the laughter like a bell. "Some women need diamonds to catch the light. Others prefer to be the light." The silence that followed was stunned. Jessica's mouth opened, then closed. She looked furious. "Bold words," Jessica hissed, "for someone wearing a dress that smells like mothballs." "Actually," a booming voice interrupted them, "it smells like lavender and old money." The group parted. Richard Kensington, the senior partner, stepped in. He was a large man, intimidating, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He wasn't looking at Jessica or Carter. He was looking at Sarah with a puzzled expression. "Mrs. Miller," Richard said, nodding. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "Sarah, please," she said, extending a hand. She didn't shake his hand like an American, pumping it up and down. She offered her hand with the palm slightly down, a gesture that forced Richard to bow slightly over it, without him even realizing he was doing it. "A pleasure," Richard murmured, clearly struck by the odd authority this poor housewife commanded. "We were just discussing the guest of honor. He's arriving shortly." "Guest of honor?" David asked, grateful for the subject change. "Yes." Jessica jumped back in, desperate to reclaim the spotlight. "Lord Alistair Montgomery, the Duke of Sussex's cousin or something. He's in town for the British Consulate's trade summit. Richard managed to snag him for the gala. It's a huge coup," Jessica preened. "I've actually been practicing my curtsy, and I bought this dress specifically because I read that the Montgomerys favor red. I'm going to make sure he remembers the bank's name." She turned a sneering look back to Sarah. "You might want to stand in the back, Sarah. You know how strict British aristocracy can be about presentation. We wouldn't want him to think Kensington and Associates hires, well, people who shop at the Salvation Army." Sarah took a sip of her water. The corner of her lip twitched. "I imagine Lord Montgomery is more interested in conversation than hemlines, Jessica," Sarah said. "But by all means, practice your curtsy." "I will," Jessica snapped. "And when he's charming me, you can enjoy the view from the buffet line." Suddenly the heavy oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open. The music stopped. The chatter died instantly. A hush fell over the room as a phalanx of security entered, followed by a tall, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s. He wore a sash of honor and medals on his lapel. This was Lord Alistair Montgomery. The room held its breath. Jessica Banks smoothed her dress, a predator preparing to pounce. But Sarah Miller just sighed, a sound so quiet only David heard it. "Oh dear," she whispered. "I hope he's forgiven me for the incident with the polo ponies." David looked at her, confused. "What?" "Nothing," Sarah said, her eyes locked on the Duke's cousin. "Just stay close to me, David." The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted from casual networking to a frenzy of sycophancy. As Lord Alistair Montgomery moved through the crowd, accompanied by his entourage and a nervous-looking hotel manager, the guests parted like the Red Sea. Richard Kensington, seeing his opportunity to elevate the firm's status, straightened his tie and signaled for his group to form a welcoming line. "Everyone, stand straight," Jessica hissed, elbowing David in the ribs. "And for heaven's sake, hide the wife." She didn't just whisper it. She maneuvered her body to physically block Sarah from view, positioning herself in front of David's wife like a satin-clad human shield. Jessica fluffed her hair, pulled her crimson neckline a fraction lower, and put on a smile that was all teeth and ambition. "He's coming this way," Carter whispered, checking his reflection in his empty wineglass. Lord Alistair was a man who wore his authority lightly, but it was there in the way he walked, slow, deliberate, unhurried. He was chatting politely with the senator, but his eyes were scanning the room, looking bored. He had attended 1,000 of these galas. They were all the same. bad wine, desperate climbers, and hollow conversation. As the group approached the Kensington and Associates circle, Richard stepped forward. "Lord Montgomery," Richard boomed, extending a hand. "Richard Kensington, an honor to have you at our winter solstice gala. We are big admirers of your work with the Global Heritage Fund." Alistair shook the hand briefly. "Charmed, Mr. Kensington. A lovely venue." "May I present my senior team?" Richard gestured. "This is Carter Banks, one of our brightest stars, and his lovely wife, Jessica." Jessica dropped into a curtsy that was so deep it bordered on theatrical comedy. She held it for a beat too long, her eyes turned upward towards the Lord, fluttering her lashes. "My lord," she breathed, rising. "It is simply overwhelming to meet you. I was just reading about your estate in Cornwall. I told Carter we simply must visit the English countryside. It's the only place where people truly understand refinement." Alistair offered a tight, polite smile. "Cornwall is wet this time of year, Mrs. Banks, but thank you." "And this," Richard continued, "is David Miller, another associate." David stepped forward, shaking the Lord's hand. "Sir." Alistair looked at David, then looked over David's shoulder. He seemed to be searching for something, or someone. His brow furrowed slightly. Jessica, sensing the Lord's attention wandering, panicked. She needed to keep the spotlight. She needed a villain to contrast with her own perfection. She stepped aside, revealing Sarah, who was standing quietly behind David, clutching her small, worn handbag. "And this," Jessica said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, "is Sarah, David's spouse." Alistair's gaze landed on Sarah. Sarah didn't curtsy. She didn't smile. She stood with her weight perfectly distributed on both feet, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She met the Lord's eyes with a gaze that was level, calm, and oddly challenging. Jessica let out a nervous laugh. "Oh dear. Forgive her, my lord. She's not accustomed to these circles. I told her the dress was a bit drab for such an occasion, but some people just don't have an eye for occasion, do they?" The circle of wives tittered. It was the moment they had been waiting for, the public dressing down of the poor mouse. "In fact," Jessica continued, emboldened by the silence, "Sarah was just telling us how she prefers thrifting. Can you imagine bringing second-hand velvet into the Fairmont?" She turned to Sarah, her eyes flashing with malice. "Sarah, maybe you should go check on the coats. I think the staff might need help. You'd fit right in." The cruelty of the remark hung in the air. David's face went red. He opened his mouth to shout, to tell Jessica to go to hell, career be damned. But Sarah squeezed his hand hard, silencing him. She took one step forward, bypassing Jessica entirely. She stopped 2 feet from Lord Alistair Montgomery. The security guards tensed, ready to intercept the poor woman who was approaching the VIP. But Alistair didn't back away. His eyes widened. The bored expression vanished, replaced by a look of utter, bewildering shock. He squinted, as if trying to reconcile the woman in the faded dress with a memory from a different life. "Thrifting?" Alistair repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like a foreign object. He looked at Jessica, then back to Sarah. "The dress is vintage," Sarah said. Her voice was different now. It wasn't the soft, submissive voice of the housewife. It was crisp, projected, the vowels clipped and perfect. 1958. Balenciaga, a gift from my godmother. Jessica scoffed loud enough for the table to hear. "Balenciaga? From a thrift store? Please don't lie to the Lord, it's pathetic." "It wasn't a thrift store," Sarah said, never breaking eye contact with Alistair. "It was the wardrobe at Sandringham." The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a lull in conversation, but the dead silence of a vacuum. Jessica blinked. "Sandringham? What is she talking about? She's delusional. David, get her out of here before she embarrasses the firm." Jessica reached out to grab Sarah's arm, her perfectly manicured nails extending like claws. "Come on, honey. Let's get you some water. You're clearly having a moment. Do not touch her." The voice didn't come from David. It didn't come from Richard. It came from Lord Alistair Montgomery. And it wasn't a polite request. It was a command, thundered with the absolute authority of a man whose ancestors had commanded armies. Jessica froze, her hand inches from Sarah's sleeve. She looked at Alistair, terrified. I was just... Alistair ignored her completely. He stepped closer to Sarah, ignoring the security detail, ignoring the gaping stares of the senior partners. He looked at her face, really looked at it, and then his eyes drifted to a small, barely visible scar on her left brow. His face crumbled. The arrogance melted away, replaced by a profound, trembling emotion. "The incident with the polo ponies," Alistair whispered, his voice shaking. 1998. Windsor. You fell off Jupiter because you were trying to ride bareback. Sarah smiled, and for the first time that night, it was a genuine, warm smile that lit up her entire face. "Hello, Alistair. You've gotten grey." If silence had a weight, the air in the Fairmont ballroom was now crushing. 300 of Seattle's elite were frozen, glasses halfway to their mouths, witnessing something their brains couldn't process. The charity case wife was on a first-name basis with the guest of honor. Jessica Banks looked like she had been slapped. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. You know her?" she stammered, looking at Alistair. "But she's nobody. She's David's poor wife. She works at a library." Alistair turned his head slowly to look at Jessica. The look was withering. It was the kind of look that could strip paint off a wall. "Nobody?" Alistair repeated quietly. "You think she is nobody?" He turned back to Sarah, and then to the absolute horror of Richard Kensington and the entire executive board. Lord Alistair Montgomery, cousin to the Duke, holder of the Order of the Garter, a man who did not bow to anyone outside of the direct line of succession, took a step back. He placed his right hand over his heart. He bent his left leg, and he bowed. It was a deep, formal court bow, a bow of subservience, a bow of recognition. "Your Highness," Alistair said, his voice ringing clearly through the silent room. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a glass. It shattered, but no one looked down. David, standing next to Sarah, looked as if the floor was tilting under his feet. He looked at his wife, the woman who clipped coupons, the woman who darned his socks, the woman who ate leftovers so he could have a fresh lunch. "Sarah?" David whispered. "Highness?" Sarah sighed. It was a sigh of resignation. The game was up. She reached out and gently touched Alistair's shoulder, signaling him to rise. "Please, Alistair," she said softly. "Stand up. You're making a scene, and you know how much I hate scenes." Alistair straightened, his eyes shining with tears. "We thought you were dead," he choked out. "The family. After the crash in the Alps, the report said, we mourned you for 3 years, Sarah. 3 years. I needed to leave, Alistair. You know why. I couldn't stay in that cage anymore. I couldn't be the spare heir to the Duchy of Luxembourg-Nassau anymore." She turned to David, whose face was a mask of shock and betrayal. Sarah's expression softened into desperate pleading. "David," she said, ignoring the gasps of "Luxembourg" and "Duchy" erupting around them. "I'm sorry. I didn't want you to find out like this. I wanted to be Sarah Miller. Just Sarah Miller. Because Sarah Miller is the only version of me that has ever been truly happy." But the room wasn't listening to the romance. They were processing the data. Richard Kensington, the boss who had hesitated to give David a Christmas bonus, was suddenly doing mental calculus. Duchy, Luxembourg, royal blood. He realized with a jolt of nausea that the woman he had let Jessica Banks bully all night was likely worth more than the entire gross domestic product of the state of Washington. Jessica, however, was in denial. Her brain refused to accept that her victim was her superior. "This is a joke," Jessica shrieked. Her voice was high and hysterical. "It's a prank. David put you up to this, didn't he? To get back at me? Highness? She's wearing a $20 trench coat. She lives in a one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill. Royals don't ride the bus." Alistair turned on her with a fury that made Carter Banks step away from his own wife. "That $20 trench coat," Alistair snarled, "is likely the only thing she could wear to blend in with people so shallow they can't see nobility unless it's covered in diamonds. And as for who she is—" Alistair gestured to the head of security, who had rushed over. "Get the microphone," Alistair commanded. "No, Alistair, don't," Sarah warned. "They humiliated you, Sarah," Alistair said, his voice trembling with protective rage. "I watched them. I watched this woman treat you like dirt. They need to know who they are speaking to." The microphone was thrust into Alistair's hand. The feedback squealed, making everyone wince. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alistair announced, his voice booming over the speakers, "I apologize for the interruption, but it is my profound honor, and my greatest shock, to announce that we are in the presence of royalty tonight." He swept a hand toward Sarah. "You may know her as Sarah Miller, but to the history books and to the royal courts of Europe, she is Her Royal Highness, Princess Serafina, of the House of Valois-Bourbon, Grand Duchess of the Northern Provinces, and rightful heir to the Sterling estate." Alistair paused, looking directly at Jessica Banks. "She is also the woman who funded the scholarship program that paid for your husband's law degree, Mrs. Banks. The anonymous royal donor your husband wrote a thank you letter to 10 years ago. That was her." The color drained from Carter Banks' face. He looked at Sarah. He looked at his wife. He looked like he was going to vomit. Jessica staggered back. "No, that's impossible." "Is it?" Sarah spoke up. She didn't use the microphone. She didn't need to. She possessed the room completely. "I left my title behind, Jessica, because I wanted to see if people could be kind without a financial incentive. I wanted to see if I could be loved for me, not for the crown." She looked sadly at the group of women who had tormented her. "I found love," she said, looking at David. "But I also found something else. I found that some people are so poor, all they have is money." The silence that followed was absolute. It was broken only by the sound of Richard Kensington frantically pushing his way through the crowd, sweating profusely, trying to get to David. "David! David! Old boy!" Richard stammered, his face a rictus of terror. I had no idea. Obviously the partnership is yours. Senior partner, name your salary. Anything." David looked at his boss. Then he looked at Sarah, Princess Serafina. He didn't look happy. He looked heartbroken. "We need to talk," David said to her, his voice devoid of emotion. "Now." Sarah nodded. The drama of the revelation was over, but the drama of her marriage was just beginning. "Take me home, David," she said. "Home?" Jessica whispered, slumped against the ice sculpture, defeated. "Yes," Sarah said, casting one last look at the woman who had made her life hell. "To my one-bedroom apartment, where I am happier than you will ever be in your mansion." She took David's arm. The crowd parted instantly, bowing and scraping as they walked towards the exit. But Sarah didn't look at them. She was only looking at her husband, wondering if her lie had cost her the only thing that actually mattered. As they reached the doors, Alistair called out, "Your Highness, where are you going? I must alert the consulate. The press." Sarah didn't turn back. She just raised a hand. "Tell them Sarah Miller went home to wash the dishes, Alistair. Leave me be." The doors closed, leaving the ballroom in chaos. The taxi ride from the Fairmont Olympic to their apartment in Capitol Hill was the longest 20 minutes of Sarah's life. In the gala ballroom, she had stood tall against the socialites and the billionaires. She had commanded the room with the blood of queens running through her veins. But here, in the back seat of a smelling yellow cab, sitting next to the man she loved, she felt small. David stared out the window. The streetlights flickered over his face, illuminating a jaw set in stone. He hadn't said a word since they walked out the doors. He hadn't held her hand. When they arrived at their building, a brick structure with a slightly sticking front door, and a lobby that smelled faintly of damp wool. The contrast was jarring. An hour ago, men were bowing to her. Now, she was fumbling for keys to a mailbox that wouldn't close properly. They walked up the 3 flights of stairs in silence. Sarah unlocked the door to Unit 3B. The apartment was exactly as they had left it. The half-chopped carrots were still on the cutting board. The dish towel was crumpled on the counter. It was the sanctuary of their modest, shared life. But as Sarah stepped inside, the space felt different. It felt like a stage set for a play that had just been cancelled. David walked to the kitchen, loosened his tie, and poured a glass of water. His hands were shaking. "David," Sarah started, her voice barely a whisper. "Please say something." David slammed the glass down on the counter. The water sloshed over the sides. "What do you want me to say, Sarah?" He turned to her, his eyes red-rimmed. "Or should I call you Serafina? Or Your Highness? I don't even know who is standing in my kitchen." "I am still me," Sarah pleaded, taking a step forward. "I am still the woman who watches bad reality TV with you. I am still the woman who burns the toast." "No, you're not," David snapped. "That woman was a lie. That woman was a character you wrote." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small linoleum floor. "Do you know what it felt like tonight, standing there? I felt like an idiot, Sarah, a complete fool. I've been scraping by, working 60-hour weeks, stressing about buying you a winter coat, feeling guilty that I couldn't give you the life you deserved. And all the while, you were sitting on a fortune that could buy the whole city." "I didn't want the money," Sarah cried, tears finally spilling over. "I ran away from it, David. You don't understand what that life is like. It's a cage. It's cold. And it's lonely. And everyone wants something from you. When I met you, it was the first time someone looked at me and didn't see a title. You saw me." "I saw a lie," David said brutally. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid," she admitted. "I was afraid that if you knew, you would change, or you would be intimidated. Or worse, you would look at me the way Jessica Banks looks at a designer bag. As an asset." David laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "So you tested me? Is that it? For 4 years, our marriage has been a pop quiz. Let's see if David really loves me while we eat ramen noodles. It wasn't a test. It was an escape." Sarah leaned against the refrigerator, her strength failing her. Alistair told the truth. There was a crash. My fiancé. He died. The press. They were relentless. They blamed me. They said I was driving even though I wasn't. I couldn't breathe, David. I had to die so I could live." She looked up at him, her eyes searching for the kindness she knew was there. "When I found you in that library, I wasn't looking for a husband. I was looking for a reason to keep going. You gave me that. You gave me a normal life. That is worth more than any palace." David looked at her. The anger was still there, but beneath it was a deep, aching hurt. He looked at the woman in the velvet dress, the dress of a princess, standing in their cheap kitchen. "I believe you," David said quietly. "I believe you were running from pain. But you made me a participant in a fraud. You let people humiliate you. You let Jessica treat you like dirt." "Why?" "Because their opinions don't matter," Sarah said firmly. "They matter to me," David shouted, his voice cracking. "It kills me when they look down on you. And tonight, watching you humiliate them. It didn't feel like a victory, Sarah. It felt like I was watching a stranger destroy people. It was terrifying." He walked past her towards the bedroom. He grabbed a pillow and a blanket from the closet. "David?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I can't sleep in there tonight," David said, moving towards the sofa. "I can't lay next to you and pretend I know you. I need time. I need to think." "David, please, don't," he said, turning his back to her. "Just don't command me right now, Your Highness." The title was a slap in the face. Sarah stood alone in the hallway, listening to the man she loved settle onto the lumpy couch. She had won the war in the ballroom, but she had lost the peace at home. She went into the bedroom, unzipped the vintage Balenciaga dress, and let it pool on the floor. She put on David's old t-shirt, curled up in the empty bed, and cried herself to sleep. Sarah woke up to a sound she hadn't heard in 4 years, the low, steady hum of a crowd. She sat up, disoriented. For a second, she thought she was back in the palace of the Grand Duchy, but the peeling paint on the ceiling reminded her she was in Seattle. She looked at the clock. 7 a.m. David was not on the couch. There was a note on the coffee table. Gone to work. Don't answer the door. Sarah walked to the window and peeked through the blinds. Her heart stopped. The street below, usually empty except for a garbage truck, was a sea of vans. Satellite dishes pointed at their building like accusation fingers. Men with long-lens cameras were perched on top of cars. Reporters in trench coats were doing stand-ups in front of the building's graffiti-covered door. The secret was out. The modern world did not keep secrets, especially not when Lord Alastair Montgomery had practically broadcast it on a loudspeaker. She turned on the small TV in the corner. The local news anchor, a woman she usually liked, looked breathless. Shock waves through the Seattle social scene and the international community. The woman known as Sarah Miller, wife of a local architect, has been identified by Lord Alastair Montgomery as Princess Serafina, the lost Duchess, who was presumed dead 3 years ago. Questions are swirling. Why is she here? Is she claiming her estate? And how did she manage to live undetected in a working-class neighborhood for so long? The screen cut to footage from the night before, a shaky cell phone video of Alastair bowing. Then it cut to a picture of Jessica Banks, looking disheveled and terrified, running to her car. Sarah turned off the TV. She felt sick. Across town, at the glass and steel offices of Kensington and Associates, the atmosphere was funereal. David sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, though he wasn't reading anything. His inbox was full. 4,000 unread emails, requests for interviews, book deals, and apologies from people who hadn't spoken to him in years. The office was eerily quiet. Usually Carter Banks would be loud on the phone, bragging about his weekend. Today Carter's office was empty. David? David looked up. Richard Kensington stood in the doorway. The senior partner looked like he hadn't slept. He was sweating, despite the air conditioning. Richard, David said dully, if you're here to fire me for the deception, just do it. I don't have the energy to fight. Fire you? Richard laughed nervously, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. Good God, no. David, you are the most valuable asset this firm has ever had. I just wanted to apologize, personally, for the oversight regarding your bonus and your office. Richard gestured frantically behind him. 2 interns were currently moving Carter Banks's things out of the corner office, the one with the view of the Sound. We're moving you into the corner suite, Richard said rapidly, and we've terminated Carter. David frowned. You fired Carter. Why? Conduct unbecoming, Richard said, his voice hard. We can't have employees who harass royalty. It reflects poorly on the brand. And frankly, his work was substandard. We all knew it. We just tolerated it. You tolerated it because his family is rich, David said, standing up. And now you're firing him because my wife is richer. It's the same game, Richard. You're just betting on a different horse. Richard flushed. It's business, David. Now about the press. We've hired a private security detail for you. They're downstairs. I don't want your security, David said, grabbing his briefcase. I'm going home. Meanwhile, in the affluent suburb of Bellevue, the curtains were drawn tight in the Banks residence. Jessica Banks sat on her floor, surrounded by fashion magazines she usually worshipped. Her phone had been ringing non-stop since midnight, but it wasn't friends calling to gossip. It was the board of the Charity League, asking for her resignation. It was the country club, informing her that her membership was under review due to a violation of the guest code of conduct. It was her husband, Carter, screaming at her from the other room because he'd just been fired via email. She had built her entire life on the premise that she was better than others. She had weaponized her status. And in one night, a woman in a thrift store dress had nuked her entire existence without raising her voice. Jessica scrolled through social media. The hashtag #ThePeoplePrincess was trending. There were memes of her face, the moment of shock when Alistair bowed, captioned with brutal mockery, "When you realize the poor girl owns the country you're trying to visit. Karma wears vintage." Jessica threw her phone across the room. It shattered against the wall. She sobbed, not out of remorse, but out of the realization that she had punched down, only to find out she was hitting a ceiling made of titanium. Back at the apartment, Sarah was pacing. The phone in the kitchen rang. She let it ring. Suddenly there was a heavy knock at the door. Not the polite knock of a neighbor, but the authoritative thud of law enforcement. Sarah froze. Had they come to deport her? To arrest her for identity fraud? She walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It wasn't the police. It was Lord Alistair. And behind him stood two men who looked like mountains in suits, royal protection officers. Sarah opened the door. "Alistair," she sighed, "I told you to leave me alone." Lord Alistair stepped inside, looking around the small, cluttered apartment with a mixture of horror and fascination. He stepped over a pile of David's shoes. "Your Highness," Alistair said, bowing his head slightly, "I cannot leave you alone. The Grand Duke, your uncle, has been informed. He is displeased you are alive, but relieved the lineage is secure. But that is not why I am here." "Why are you here?" "Because you are under siege," Alistair said, gesturing to the window. "The press is not going to leave. The paparazzi are flying in from London, Paris, Milan. By tonight, this street will be impassable. You cannot stay here, Serafina. It isn't safe." "I am Sarah," she insisted, "and this is my home." "This was your home," Alistair corrected gently, "but you blew up the bridge last night. You cannot unring the bell. You'll need extraction. I have a car in the alley. We can take you to a secure location." "I'm not going without David," Sarah said. "He is welcome to come," Alistair said stiffly, "though I imagine he is processing." Just then, the front door opened. David walked in. He looked exhausted. He saw Alistair and the two guards in his living room. He didn't look surprised. He just looked defeated. "David," Sarah said, rushing to him. "They want us to leave. They say it's not safe." David looked at the guards, then at Sarah. "They're right," David said. "I can't even get into the building without pushing through cameras. My boss fired Carter and gave me his office just to suck up to you. My whole world has turned into a circus." "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "Stop apologizing," David said. He took a deep breath. "I don't want to run away, Sarah, but we can't stay here. Not tonight." He turned to Alistair. "Where are you taking us?" "The penthouse at the Fairmont," Alistair said. "We have secured the entire top floor." David let out a dry laugh. "Back to the scene of the crime." "Fine." He went to the bedroom and packed a bag. He didn't pack a suit. He packed jeans and t-shirts. He walked back out and took Sarah's hand. His grip was loose, tentative. "Let's go," David said. As they walked out the back exit into the waiting armored SUV, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the side mirror. She looked like a fugitive. She had revealed her title to save her dignity, but as the car pulled away, shielding them from the flashing lights, she realized the terrifying truth. The world now knew she was a princess, but she had no idea if she was still a wife. The penthouse of the Fairmont Olympic was a world away from the peeling paint and dripping faucets of Capitol Hill. It was a sprawling expanse of marble floors, silk drapes, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city lights, lights that looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet. David stood by the window, looking out. In his hand was a crystal tumbler of whiskey that cost more than his first car. He looked like a man trapped in a golden cage. Sarah sat on the edge of a massive, cream-colored sofa. She had changed into a simple white robe provided by the hotel, shedding the velvet armor of the night before. Without the dress, without the makeup, she looked like Sarah again. But the air between them was charged with a static electricity that made it hard to breathe. "It's funny," David said, his voice low and devoid of humor. "I spent 4 years worrying that I wasn't enough for you. I worried that I couldn't buy you a house. I worried that I couldn't take you to Paris. And all this time, you owned Paris." He turned to face her. "Why did you stay, Sarah? You could have left at any moment. When the radiator broke last winter and we froze for 3 days, you could have snapped your fingers and been in a palace. Why did you suffer?" Sarah looked down at her hands that were rough from washing dishes without gloves. "Because the cold in that apartment was honest," she said softly. "The cold in the palace was different, David. It was a cold of indifference. Yes, I had servants. Yes, I had money. But I was a broodmare for a dynasty. My fiancé, the man I was supposed to marry, he didn't love me. He loved the merger of our estates. When I died, I didn't just run away from the title. I ran away from a life where I was a transaction." She stood up and walked toward him, stopping just out of reach. "I didn't suffer with you, David. I lived. For the first time. I learned how to cook. Badly. I learned how to budget. I learned that when you brought me flowers from the grocery store, it meant more than a greenhouse full of orchids because you worked for them." David looked at her, the anger in his eyes warring with the love that still anchored him. "But everything has changed. Look at this place. Look at the people downstairs. They don't see Sarah Miller anymore. They see the Duchess. If we go back out there, I become the Duchess's husband. I become a footnote." "Is that what you're afraid of?" Sarah asked gently. "That you'll be eclipsed?" "I'm afraid I'll lose you," David admitted, his voice cracking. "I'm afraid that this world, Alistair's world, will swallow you whole. I can't compete with history, Sarah. I'm just an architect." Before Sarah could answer, the double doors of the suite opened. Lord Alistair marched in, looking grave. He held a satellite phone. "Your Highness," Alistair said, bypassing David entirely. "The Grand Duke is on the line. He has seen the news. He is demanding your immediate return to Luxembourg. The jet is being fueled at Boeing Field as we speak. He says the vacation is over." The room went silent. This was the moment. The fork in the road. David stepped back, his face closing off. He was waiting for her to leave. He was expecting it. Sarah looked at the phone in Alistair's hand. She looked at the luxury around her. Then she looked at David, a man wearing wrinkled jeans and a look of absolute heartbreak. She walked over to Alistair. She took the phone. "Uncle," she said into the receiver. Her voice was steady, regal. She listened for a moment as a tiny voice shouted on the other end. "No," Sarah interrupted. "I will not be coming home. Not today. Not ever." Alistair gasped. "Your Highness." "My name is Sarah Miller," she continued into the phone, her eyes locked on David. "I have a life here. I have a husband. And I am happy. You can keep the estate. You can keep the titles. Give them to my cousin. I formally abdicate my claim to the succession." The voice on the other end sputtered. "However," Sarah added, a steely glint entering her eye, "I will be keeping my personal trust fund, the one my grandmother left me, and I will be using it to fund legal action if you try to force me back. Good night, Uncle." She hung up the phone and handed it back to a stunned Alistair. "You can go now, Alistair," she said. "And please tell the press that if they don't get off my lawn, I'll buy their publishing houses and fire them all." Alistair blinked. Then a slow, small smile spread across his face. "As you wish. Mrs. Miller." He bowed, lower than before, and left the room. When the doors clicked shut, Sarah turned to David. "You gave it up," David whispered. "The title, the power. You gave it all up again." "I told you," Sarah said, closing the distance between them. I already have everything I want." David looked at her, really looked at her, and finally the wall came down. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck. He held her like he was trying to keep her from floating away. "I love you," he murmured against her skin. "I love you so much. But we are going to have to move. I can't live in that apartment anymore. Not with the paparazzi." Sarah pulled back, smiling mischievously. "Well, since I decided to keep the trust fund, I think we can afford a house. Maybe one with a dishwasher?" David laughed. A genuine, relieved sound. "Yeah, a dishwasher sounds good." The charity gala season in Seattle had a new queen, but she was unlike any the city had seen before. Sarah Miller, still going by Mrs. Miller, sat at the head table of the New Horizons fundraiser. She wasn't wearing jewels, she was wearing a simple, elegant black dress. Next to her sat David, now a senior partner at his own firm, Miller and Associates. They were laughing, sharing a joke, ignoring the photographers who still hovered at the perimeter. At the back of the room, standing near the kitchen entrance, was a woman in a server's uniform. She was balancing a tray of champagne flutes. It was Jessica Banks. After the scandal, the social exile had been swift and brutal. Carter had lost his job, and the debts had piled up. Jessica, stripped of her status, had to work. She watched Sarah Miller, Princess Serafina, lean over and whisper something to her husband, causing him to kiss her cheek. Jessica expected to feel anger. She expected to feel bitterness. But as she watched the way Sarah looked at David, with a look of pure, unadulterated adoration that no amount of money could buy, Jessica just felt empty. She realized, too late, the lesson Sarah had tried to teach her that night at the Fairmont. Sarah looked up, her gaze scanning the room, her eyes locked with Jessica's. For a second, Jessica wanted to run, but Sarah didn't sneer. She didn't point. She simply nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and then turned back to her husband. It was the ultimate victory. Sarah didn't need to destroy Jessica. She just needed to be happy. And she was. Sarah Miller proved that true nobility isn't about the blood in your veins or the title before your name. It's about the grace with which you treat others, even when they treat you with contempt. She could have crushed her enemies with a word. Instead, she killed them with kindness and a little bit of truth. In a world full of Jessica Banks, pretending to be rich, be a Sarah Miller. Be rich in character, because money can be lost, titles can be abdicated, but who you are when you have nothing, that is your true crown. What a roller coaster, right? I still can't believe the look on Jessica's face when Alistair bowed. It really makes you think about how we judge people by their appearance. If you enjoyed this story of secret royalty and sweet revenge, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a drama. What would you do if you found out your partner was secretly royalty? Would you be angry like David or thrilled? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.